the lost Moses. In the history of the Church, we see how Jesus' teaching of love, spiritual growth, and nonviolence was buried under complex dogmas. Dogmas about the Trinity, atonement, predestination, clerical hierarchy, and rituals ranging from infant baptism to indulgences and the Crusades. How could Jesus call people to love your enemies when Christians later killed heretics and non-believers? Therefore, we can reasonably assume that something similar happened with the teachings of Moses, especially considering that the Torah contains no clear distinction between divine revelation and later additions. The teaching of Moses was distorted and transformed into what is now called Judaism. This claim is supported by multiple lines of evidence: historical, critical, textual, philosophical, and even the Gospels themselves. The conflict between Jesus and the Jews of his time centers around the understanding of the Mosaic Law. It seems Jesus believed that Moses' original teaching existed in a simpler and ethically oriented form, but was later expanded by priestly editors. History suggests this happened during and after the Babylonian exile. Jesus insisted that the priests and scribes had distorted the teachings of Moses. The question is, how much distortion occurred? The answer is a great deal. According to the documentary hypothesis, the Torah is made up of texts written by different authors in different centuries. The most ritualistic and legally detailed parts, such as the book of Leviticus, belong to the priestly source, or P, dated to the 6th or 5th century before Christ, long after the time of Moses. Take, for example, the so-called unclean food laws. In Deuteronomy chapter 14 and Leviticus chapter 11, there are clear differences in the list of unclean animals. Moses himself dined with non-Hebrews, such as his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. There was no indication that Moses demanded kosher food or that any law was being violated. We read the words of Jesus. "Nothing that enters a man from the outside can defile him, for it does not enter his heart, but his stomach." The evangelist adds, "Thus he declared all foods clean." This was a direct confrontation with the Pharisaic and priestly tradition, not with the teaching of Moses itself. Jesus represented the original prophetic spirit of Israel, and his position implies that dietary restrictions were later distortions of what Moses actually taught. Archaeological findings in the hill country of Palestine, dating from the 12th to the 10th century before Christ, show that early Israelites ate pork. Therefore, the taboos were not universal. Food restrictions often emerge in closed societies as a way to separate themselves from outsiders. These rules may function as political and cultural tools rather than divine commandments. What else besides the laws of clean and unclean food did the priests and scribes add to the Torah? All of their insertions were part of historical revisions. Deuteronomy from chapter 12 to chapter 26 presents a codified version of the law that appeared during the reign of King Josiah in the 7th century before Christ as part of a religious reform. The text itself admits in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 8, "You shall not do as we are doing here today, everyone doing what is right in his own eyes." This was an ordinary reform movement, not prophecy or a mere reminder of Moses. The priest's main addition involved the sacrificial system. It has long been noted that the prophets of Israel opposed ritualism. Isaiah, Hosea, Amos all proclaimed that God does not desire sacrifices and rituals, but mercy, justice, and a pure heart. "Your sacrifices are not pleasing to me. Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Learn to do good, seek justice." Isaiah chapter 1, verse 11. This directly contradicts the highly detailed cultic system in Leviticus, as if two parallel religions existed, one prophetic and ethical, the other ritualistic and ceremonial. Sacrifices became the center of worship only with the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, not during Moses' time, but during the period of the kings. What did the priests add? Detailed rituals for sin offerings, guilt offerings, burnt offerings, peace offerings, and so on, especially in the book of Leviticus. Specific descriptions of who, how, where, and when sacrifices must be made, what animals to use, and at what stage of life. Moses spent much of his time in the wilderness, far from any temple. If there were rituals, they could not have been that elaborate. To centralize power and formalize religion, the priests also introduced harsh criminal laws, including capital punishment for relatively minor infractions. Stoning was added for blasphemy, Sabbath breaking, homosexual acts, disobedience to parents, along with various physical punishments such as cutting off hands and other forms of execution. Why is it doubtful that God gave these commands? Because in Deuteronomy and Exodus, there are different versions of the punishment for the same crimes, because the prophets and Jesus focus on mercy and repentance, not bloody retribution. Such brutal punishments are characteristic of patriarchal, agrarian societies. They served to strengthen the state of Israel and were imposed by priests with a political mindset, not by God through Moses. The laws about ceremonial purity and unclean states also appear to be later additions. We find long chapters explaining when a person is unclean. After childbirth, menstruation, touching a corpse, having leprosy, and so on. There are descriptions of purification rituals, washings, and offerings for cleansing. Why is this doubtful? Because these laws are not directly tied to morality. They reflect ritual culture and ancient fears more than divine will. Jesus openly violated purity laws. He touched lepers, a bleeding woman, and the dead. This system of taboos, introduced by the priests, also served to consolidate national religion and unify the people. What else was added by men to the Torah? A complex system of festivals and pilgrimages, mandatory pilgrimages to Jerusalem, exact festival dates, and detailed instructions on how to observe Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuot. These laws are emphasized especially in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Why is this doubtful? Because during the wilderness period after the Exodus from Egypt, formalized liturgies were unlikely. These festivals may have been agricultural customs later sanctified and attributed to Moses. Also added were patriarchal norms and female subjugation, laws about virginity tests, selling daughters, and purification rituals for women after childbirth. Women's rights were stripped away. They came to be seen as property. These norms likely reflect the culture of the ancient Near East, not divine revelation. The teachings of Jesus are far more egalitarian and allow for an active role for women in spiritual life. We must also mention the centralization of the cult in one temple and the consolidation of priestly power. It was forbidden to build altars outside of Jerusalem. Only descendants of Aaron, the priests, and the Levites could serve in the temple. However, Moses functioned more as a spiritual leader whose authority did not rely on temple structures. In the earlier texts, sacrifices were offered on simple altars, under trees or in tents, for example. Jesus rejected the focus on the Jerusalem temple, and this was one of the main reasons the priests hated him. Worshipping the temple brought the priests enormous wealth. Finally, Israel's religious elite promoted nationalist, ethnocentric laws. They added bans on intermarriage with foreigners. In the context of Israel's political formation, priests glorified the destruction of all the peoples of Canaan without compassion. But this contradicts the prophetic vision of a God of all nations. Jesus, Paul, and the prophets, such as Jonah, extend God's mercy and revelation beyond Israel. Jesus often condemned Jewish nationalism, saying that other nations would take Israel's place in serving God and humanity. This very conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees and Sadducees regarding the interpretation of Moses' law became the stumbling block and the reason for Jesus' execution. Jesus understood Moses' law without the later additions, those soulless, often inhumane insertions by priests and scribes, and those insertions are not in some later commentary, but in the Torah itself. The moment Jesus voiced a more spiritual understanding of Moses, the priests labeled him a threat to the state, an enemy of Israel and of Moses. The greatest tragedy of Israel and Judaism remains this: they have yet to seek the true meaning of Moses' teaching and still rely on a distorted version of their ancient lawgiver's message.